Welcome, everyone, to the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. I am licensed battlefield guide Eric Lindblade, and I am here with my co-host, licensed battlefield guide Jim Hessler. Jim, what kind of episode do we got coming up today?
Well, I think, Eric, we have another great episode for you and the listeners. As battlefield guides, Eric and I both believe that one of the most commonly asked battlefield questions that we receive, after where's the bathroom and have you ever seen a ghost, the most commonly asked military-based question that we ever receive might be, what was Robert E. Lee thinking on July 3rd, 1863, when he launched what became known as Pickett's Charge? And that's going to be the topic of today's episode. What was Robert E. Lee thinking on July 3rd?
And I should add, with this episode, we are not doing a complete blow-by-blow breakdown of what becomes known as Pickett's Charge. We're really looking at the planning and organization of this attack, going to that question, what was Lee thinking?
Right, because we want to give you, the listener, as much content over as many episodes as possible, so we don't want to wrap up something as iconic as Pickett's Charge in one or two episodes. Frankly, we're like a fine 6-course meal, Eric. We want to dish out one course at a time. We are not a fast food podcast. If you want fast food, go on Facebook. This is a fine meal, and we're going to give you a course at a time. So today is sort of the first course on Pickett's Charge, the appetizer, so to speak. What was Lee thinking?
Today we're recording episode 6 of our podcast, and we've had a lot of feedback from previous shows, and as I look back at our numbers on what people are listening to, wouldn't you know, for as many people that say they hate what-ifs, man, that Jackson episode's going through the roof. That is still our most listened to episode of all the ones we've done so far.
Still our most popular episode. I think it was a really well done episode. Obviously, again, there was a little satire in the episode title. Again, what I love about the intelligence of our core audience is they get that. You guys get that there was some satire involved. When I saw the episode promoted on some of the general Gettysburg Civil War Facebook sites, where maybe the level of discourse is a little bit lower than what we get from our core audience, I don't think everybody quite got the intended satire of that episode title. But nevertheless, the curiosity was piqued. And as Eric said, that continues to be our through-the-roof most popular episode. I think late at night, when Civil War buffs are tucking themselves into bed at night, clearly the statistics show that a number of them are thinking to themselves as they lay down their head and go to sleep, what if Jackson was at Gettysburg? And I think we did a bang-up job of that episode trying to answer that question for you.
Previous episodes were on the peach orchard. We had 2 episodes. We had so much material we needed to turn into 2. Mm-hmm. I think we've gotten a lot of feedback on that, a lot of positive reaction. People, I think, enjoyed it. One of the things that really impressed me was when people said, you made me think about what Dan Sickles did. We maybe didn't change hearts and minds. We maybe didn't change opinions, but I think at least we got people thinking, maybe looking at this in a little different light than maybe they would have, and hopefully we're chipping away at some of those preconceived notions that we had. But one area where we kind of got a little dinged, and we do appreciate that.
Yeah, we do.
Better or worse, we love feedback on our episodes. But there are a few listeners that felt that maybe we were a little unfair to William Barksdale and the performance of his brigade at Gettysburg. So, Jim, do you want to speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, superfan Doug from Canada, and in full disclosure here for the listeners, I know Doug. Doug is a friend of mine, and Doug is also prepping a William Barksdale biography. But superfan Doug and another listener, and I forget off the top of my head, the name is escaping me, and I forget that, but both of them kind of weighed in and seemed to indicate that we were a little too hard on General Barksdale personally. If you kind of rewind and remember what we discussed in the episode, and one of the themes that we used in the episode, I've used it in the Peach Orchard book, I've used it on Battlefield Tours, is kind of this reminder that although Barksdale's assault on the Peach Orchard and Emmitsburg Road in of itself was a smashing success, the movement from the Emmitsburg Road towards Cemetery Ridge ultimately created, ghastly casualties in Barksdale's brigade, including General Barksdale himself. Doug thought that perhaps we were personally criticizing General Barksdale's decision to make that move, and if it came off that way, we should clarify that all we were really saying is look at the final results. The end results speak for themselves, and that the end results of the charge would ultimately show that it was not the success that it has always been portrayed as in the Gettysburg literature. So I stand by that. But, wanted to make sure that somebody didn't think we were personally criticizing General Barksdale. Look, as Doug said on Facebook, Barksdale was in it to win it, and he saw running Yankees Yankees falling back towards Cemetery Ridge, and he continued to pursue those retreating Yankees, and I think you would expect Barksdale to do that. All we're saying is that the end result, high casualties, and really nothing of material benefit gained to the Confederate Army.
And I should add, that takes nothing away from the smashing success at the Peach Orchard. We're playing a little bit of armchair general here. I'll get that.
Yeah.
But what we're looking at is at that moment, I can see why he does it. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it didn't work out. But it still does not take away from the performance of that brigade at the intersection of the Wheatfield Road and the Emmitsburg Road.
Yeah, in the feedback we received on that was fair. It was not disrespectful or anything of that nature. So we thank Doug for bringing that to our attention, and hopefully we've clarified this, and we can go on with today's episode.
And I should just say that it was nice that we could have a disagreement.
That's right.
It was very civil.
Civil.
We had a discussion. We had a debate.
That's right.
That's nice. You don't always see that today in today's society. So that's really nice to have that. And we do respect and really value the respectful tone that our fans have had so far.
Here at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, we know how to keep it professional and get some good exchange of ideas. So again, thanks for the feedback and no harm done.
Now that we had all the podcast business out of the way, let's get to the meat of this episode. And of course, our topic this week is what was Lee thinking on July 3rd? And Jim and I both, as battlefield guides, we get this question a lot. We're staring across from Seminary Ridge or Cemetery Ridge, and you look out over this field and people say, what in the world was Lee thinking? So what we're going to try to do is answer that question, or at least delve into the thought process of Robert E. Lee and the Confederate High Command on late July 2nd into July 3rd. So what we're going to cover today is the period of the planning of this assault, famously known as Pickett's Charge, and going right up to the moment before the bombardment begins.
Yeah, and before we go back, just to kind of tack on to what Eric said, this notion of it being a commonly asked question, I mean, really for battlefield visitors, it can be almost a visceral experience because, again, you can stand at the Virginia Memorial and you can look out across that approximately 1 mile of open ground towards Cemetery Ridge, and you can see it. You can see the average visitor who otherwise might not know a whole lot about Gettysburg or the campaign. You can almost see them shake their head and just kind of say, what were they thinking to order such a charge? And I think we can get to that. And my experience has been, whether it's been on tours or more specifically when it's been out promoting our Pickett's Charge book and doing speaking engagements, people can kind of take this line of thinking the wrong way. I have been called, at least by one internet troll, a lost cause apologist, which I think is hilarious. I'm from New York. I am as far away from lost cause as you can get. But the idea being that by trying to get into Robert E. Lee's thinking, we're trying to answer a commonly asked question. We are not making excuses for Lee, and we are not trying to justify what Lee was thinking and somehow cast blame on Longstreet or any other subordinate. And I know because I've had that reaction. I used to think people would find Pickett's Charge boring because, quote unquote, everybody knew the topic. And what you find is that's not true. There are many different perceptions and understandings out there about what this charge was all about, which leads me, if I can, Eric, to a quote from Colonel Armstead Long, Lee's military secretary, who wrote in 1886, quote, "The attack of Pickett's division has been more criticized and is still less understood than any other act of the Gettysburg drama. It was not ordered without mature consideration and on grounds that presented fair prospects of success." So today we're going to try to talk about what was that mature consideration and what were those potential prospects of success.
And when I do have folks that ask that question, what was Lee thinking? And as Jim said, you do sometimes get a reaction. I've had people just stare in awe of what they're looking at and thinking, they did what? And what I often tell them is, don't think about this through the lens of what happened. We know what happens. We know this is going to be a failed attack. It's easy for us to sit here today and say, that was a bad call, because we know it fails. But let's put ourselves in the moment. Let's look at what Lee's thought process is. Let's see what his real options are on July 3rd, and let's assess it through that. Let's imagine, as Faulkner would say, they have not moved out yet. Pickett and his ringlets have not moved out yet. We're going to be in this moment right before this thing goes out, and let's try to get into Lee's head a little bit.
Yeah, and if anything, on the Barksdale feedback, we were somewhat accused of Monday morning quarterbacking, so this is something you're going to have to not do on this episode. You're going to have to pretend you don't know how it turns out, and on the morning of July 3rd, what is the situation that is going to lead Robert E. Lee to order this charge?
Now, for this episode, we usually answer listener questions at the end of the episode. It's kind of a tie-in and to put a bow on the episode. But really, we had so many on this episode that we thought we'd be here all night if we were answering listener questions. So what we've done is kind of interspersed the listener questions throughout the content today. So as we're kind of going through this thought process, some of these commonly asked questions, some of the ones that we have been asked on our social media, we're going to try to address as we go through this today. And also we'll address them individually as they warrant. So if you don't hear your name called out this episode, we promise you we've read them, we've listened to them, and in some ways we've incorporated them into what we're going to be talking about
You
today.
are all super fans in our hearts and minds this week.
All right, Jim. So what is the situation on the morning of July 3rd?
Yeah, so Eric, the situation on the morning of July 3rd is this. If you will all recall from the Peach Orchard episodes, on the Confederate right, Longstreet, although his corps is badly bruised and battered after the fighting on July 2nd, Longstreet and his corps have at least pushed forward their lines to the Emmitsburg Road in the Peach Orchard, as well as some broken lines in and around the wheat field and Devil's Den. But the Confederate line is advanced on the Confederate right flank, while on the Union left, the Yankees are reinforced on Little Round Top. Over on the Union right, opposite Culp's Hill, the Confederates have gained a foothold on Lower Culp's Hill. That's from the night of July 2nd into the morning of July 3rd. And the Federal 12th Corps, as the morning begins, is making preparations to counterattack those Confederates and basically push them off of Culp's Hill. So that's sort of just at a high level setting the table here as the morning of July 3rd begins.
And often when I think of what Lee is thinking at this moment, I think by the end of July 2nd, Lee is frustrated. He's been here for 2 days. He has really had some hard-hitting attacks on the Union Army. He's inflicted serious damage on this army, but they're still where they were the day before. In many ways, I think Lee is thinking about what happened to his army at the 7 days. What has happened to his army at Second Manassas, at Fredericksburg, and at Chancellorsville. Victories that were victories, but they were not complete victories. He has not yet scored that decisive win that his army and his nation needs. And I think that is weighing heavily on him on the morning of July 3rd.
Well, fair enough. And in Robert E. Lee's own battle report, when he talks about the segue from July 2nd into July 3rd, Lee says, quote, "These partial successes of the second day determined me to continue the assault on the next day," which is the third day. So at least if you take Lee's reports at face value, he is not feeling like a defeated man. July 1st was a Confederate success. July 2nd, he's characterizing as partial successes. And some of these partial successes, as I said, are going to convince Lee that success is attainable if we attack on July 3rd, but if we do some things differently.
So as we go back to the evening of July 2nd, the fighting on the southern end of the battlefield is essentially ended. We're still having some fighting around the Culp's Hill sector of the battlefield, but let's now kind of compare and contrast what the two Army commanders are doing at this point between George Meade and Robert E. Lee, and more specifically, what Robert E. Lee did not do on the night of July 2nd compared to his counterpart, George Gordon Meade.
Yeah, one of the command ironies of July 2nd is essentially that in the aftermath, some people criticized George Meade for calling together, in effect, a council of war, and some people will then criticize Robert E. Lee for not calling together a council of war. But George Meade essentially calls what today we call a council of war together at his headquarters on Cemetery Ridge, and after a polling and some discussion from the generals, the high command of the Union Army decides to stay and fight it out for another day. Now, there's a story repeated as Meade's council of war was breaking up that Meade supposedly went up to John Gibbon and said to the effect, "Gibbon, if they attack tomorrow, it's going to be on your front." And Gibbon says, "Well, why do you think that?" And Meade says, "Well, because they've tried the flanks and failed, and now they're going to go for my center." I'm not sure I completely believe the veracity of that story. I think it's possible that it's apocryphal and something that was kind of repeated by a favorable John Gibbon in later years. But in any event, the Council of War breaks up and the Union High Command decides they are going to stay and fight it out. Eric, what does Lee do?
Lee does nothing. He does not call a council of war. He does not bring Jeb Stuart and A.P. Hill and James Longstreet and Richard Ewell to his headquarters at another location to meet and talk about what's going on. on. And at least in my opinion, I see nothing wrong with calling a council of war. If you're the Army of the Potomac on the night of July 2nd, and you're George Meade, you want to know, what is the status report of my army? What is the condition of this army? Are we in a condition to stay here and fight, or are we in a condition to take the fight to the enemy? That's important information to know. I would also say that's important information for Robert E. Lee to know moving into July 3rd. What is the condition of James Longstreet's troops?
Yeah.
What are the condition of Richard Ewell's troops? What are the condition of A.P. Hill's troops? And get the feedback of these commanders, especially his old warhorse, his second in command, Lieutenant General James Longstreet.
Yeah, and before we get to Longstreet, I would just add from that point of view, too, you could certainly argue that the second day's Confederate attacks failed in part because of a lack of coordination, and it would have behooved Lee to probably get all of his primary subordinates together and kind of say, okay, fellas, let's go over this game plan one more time and just make sure that when we attack on July 3rd, we do it right. So, yeah, again, we're not Monday morning quarterbacking. Maybe we are a little bit, but certainly I think you've got to call out Lee a little bit for not doing that. But in Longstreet's case, Longstreet, if I remember the passage correctly in his memoirs, I think he just says something to the effect of, I did not feel up to making the ride to General Lee's headquarters that evening. And again, as armchair generals, we can question that, but you got to remember, it's been an excruciatingly long day for Longstreet up to that point. He had been at Lee's headquarters before sunrise that morning. Longstreet had been in the saddle all day, coordinating after the countermarch, coordinating the whole attack. It was hot, frustrating. Longstreet probably just, quite frankly, didn't physically and mentally feel up to going to Lee's headquarters at that hour. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, he sends a courier instead.
As we know, on the evening of July 2nd, Robert E. Lee is not going to meet with his commanders. There is no Confederate Council of War that evening. So as we move into the early morning now, what is Lee thinking at this moment? And maybe let's start kind of tracing how his thought process evolves as the day goes on, based on what is a very fluid situation on July 3rd.
Yeah, the evolution of Robert E. Lee's thinking. I have always characterized what becomes Pickett's charge as sort of a plan A versus a plan B. And I know there are colleagues and interpreters out there who do not necessarily agree with that. They think there was only one plan, and that was what became Pickett's charge. I would argue that interpretation is wrong. And what we could look at as a source material on that would be Robert E. Lee's own battle reports. So we don't even have to dive into the lost cause and all of the post-war stuff. We can look at what did Robert E. Lee say in his reports. And this is what Lee said. So we talked about, again, these partial successes from July 2nd, and what Lee said was, quote, "The result of this day's operations induced the belief that, with proper concert of action and with the increased support that the positions gained on the right would enable the artillery to render the assaulting column, we should ultimately succeed, and it was accordingly determined to continue the attack. The general plan was unchanged. Longstreet, reinforced by Pickett's 3 brigades, was ordered to attack the next morning, and General Ewell was directed to assail the enemy's right at the same time." And folks, I think that is initially Robert E. Lee's plan of attack for the morning of July 3rd.
So just to be clear, what Lee is saying is, let's do the same thing we did the day before. Let's reinforce these ends. Let's keep pushing. If we have better concert of action, if we have better coordination, we have some more hard-hitting units brought in, my veterans will get the job done.
Yeah, and that same internet troll who said I was a lost cause apologist said, among other things, that I overemphasized concert of action in Lee's report. No, I'm not overemphasizing it. That is a big component of the plan that would be different from July 2nd. Concert of action between the infantry and artillery, and concert of action coordination between the 3 infantry corps, which was clearly lacking on July 2nd. So no, I don't think we're overemphasizing that phrase in our interpretation. It's an important component of why Lee thinks he can succeed on July 3rd.
And I should add, even though the Confederates did not gain their objective on July 2nd, there was a lot coming from that attack that would have made Lee seem optimistic about it. For everything that went wrong, they still almost pulled it off. So I think Lee is feeling fairly confident on the morning of July 3rd that, hey, we put this thing together a little better. We should have some positive results.
I don't subscribe to, I think, what was often the traditional interpretation that Lee was a frustrated, physically weakened, almost half-crazed old man who's sort of rolling a desperate gamble to just slam, a couple divisions of his army against this stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. I don't subscribe to that notion at all. Lee thinks it can work. And again, he's talking about why it can work, starting with, in addition to the artillery gained at the Peach Orchard, which maybe we've kind of beaten that horse to death between our subsequent episodes. But let's talk a little bit about Culp's Hill. The Union Army right flank. When the day ended on July 2nd, Ewell's 2nd Corps, Johnson's division, has a foothold on lower Culp's Hill. So as Lee said in his report, he's clearly expecting Ewell and Longstreet to renew attacks at the same time on the morning of July 3rd. Ewell says in his own report, I received orders to attack at daylight. But Eric, what goes wrong for the Confederates?
Well, for one, the Union 12th Corps gets the jump on the Confederates. There's a massive artillery barrage on Lower Culp's Hill. Fighting begins to rage there by some accounts. 4:30 in the morning. Now Richard Ewell is sort of throwing this thing in a little bit earlier than maybe he wanted to. Longstreet has not yet budged, but now we've got some very intense fighting. I should add, the most intense fighting on Culp's Hill is on the morning of July 3rd.
Right.
So this is some very brutal, difficult fighting that Richard Ewell's men are now being thrown into, and they're not hearing anything coming from the south. And what we'll see from Richard Ewell's remembrances of this battle is that he is waiting for Longstreet to come in. He's waiting to hear something, so he's going to maybe be pushing these attacks further than maybe he should, in hopes that there will be that coordination coming from the south.
Yeah, that's a great point. What essentially has happened is the Federal Army's 12th Corps, Slocum, and General Meade have essentially taken the initiative away from General Lee. And to your point about Ewell wrote in his OR that half an hour after Johnson attacked, and when too late to recall him, I received notice that Longstreet would not attack until 10 o'clock. But as it turned out, his attack was delayed till after 2 o'clock. So to Eric's point, Ewell seems to be writing, again, in the immediate aftermath, this is not lost cause stuff, but in the immediate aftermath, Ewell seems to be writing, saying that I was expecting Longstreet to attack. Lee addresses this in one of his reports, the January 1864 report, where he says General Longstreet's dispositions were not completed as early as was expected, but before notice could be sent to Ewell, General Johnson had already become engaged, and it was too late to recall him. Not to get into the weeds on Longstreet, and again, folks, we're not bashing Longstreet, we're just trying to tell you what happened. But Eric, what's Longstreet doing right now? What does Longstreet say he's doing?
At this point, there's a lot of question in the historiography of Gettysburg as to what Longstreet's doing at this point. There's some folks that will believe that Longstreet has received an order from Lee to take part in this action with Richard Ewell, so basically an attack on each end of the line. There's some that say Longstreet never received the order. There's others that are saying that Longstreet is doing a reconnaissance at this point to get maybe another plan of action that day, maybe to head off Robert E. Lee that morning. It's very murky, as a lot of things are in the battle. So Jim, do you have anything from James Longstreet himself that might try to clear up what's going on?
Yeah, so in some of Longstreet's post-war recollections, when obviously the lost cause mudslinging was pretty deep, he disputed the notion that he had received any morning attack orders from General Lee. But I'm going to stay away from that for now. Eric and I would probably do a Lee Longstreet episode soon or at a later date. And I'm going to try to focus instead not on the lost cause, but what did Longstreet say, in a fairly contemporary moment. July 27th in Longstreet's report, what Longstreet says was, on the following morning, our arrangements were made for renewing the attack by my right with a view to pass around the hill occupied by the enemy on his left and to gain it by flank and reverse attack. This would have been a slow process, probably, but I think not very difficult. A few moments after my orders for the execution of this plan were given, the commanding general joined me and ordered a column of attack to be formed of Pickett's, Heath's, and part of Pender's division. Now, Longstreet at that point goes on and talks about how the plan transitions to an attack against Cemetery Hill, but I'm going to pause there and say what Longstreet seemed to be doing was trying to move around the Round Tops when Lee comes to him and seems to essentially tell him to stop.
And this is a little armchair generaling here, but had Longstreet tried that maneuver, there's pretty much the entire Union 6 Corps sitting out there. So I don't know how much of chance of success this really would have had. And for some of our visitors to Gettysburg, if you ever go up what I kind of consider the backside between Big and Little Round Top on what's Wright Avenue today, you'll see some of the artillery batteries out there for the 6th Corps. You'll see the 1st Vermont Brigade's monument out there. So there's some troops out there that would have contested this movement as it had happened. And I think that's probably one reason why Lee is probably thinking, you know what, I just don't like the chance of this. I don't know that they're out there, but there's odds are there's troops out there.
Yeah, and by the way, if you go to Wright and Howe Avenue, like Eric said, easily one of the least visited portions of Gettysburg National Military Park, which is a shame because there's a couple really beautiful monuments out there. But go out there, assess for yourself whether Longstreet's turning movement might have had any chance of success. For our purposes today, all we're going to say is that, again, with Johnson and Ewell already engaged at Culp's Hill, Longstreet not ready to go, Lee is going to start looking for another option.
Now as we move from the early morning hours of July 3rd into the mid-morning around 10:30, maybe even 11 o'clock, the situation we now have is Richard Ewell's assault on Culp's Hill has failed. Longstreet has not moved to the south. To me, this is an interesting point in the Battle of Gettysburg because Robert E. Lee at this moment really has 3 options. 1, I can hold my line where it is and maybe hope that George Meade will launch an attack against me. But that puts the ball in Meade's hands. Robert E. Lee is not a general that likes to do that. Lee wants to drive the action. He wants to have the initiative. The second option is Lee could begin to withdraw his army from the Gettysburg area, maybe find a new location to try to fight this battle to draw the Union Army in. But once again, there's no guarantee the Union Army is going to follow him, and also that's a challenging maneuver to do, to disengage your army and move to a new location. But there's also a third option. Look for a weak part of the Union line and potentially try to make a strike there that might break the Union line and deliver to the Army of Northern Virginia this decisive victory they are seeking in the Keystone State.
That's well said, Eric. And so these morning hours continue to whittle away as Lee, Longstreet, other generals, and their assembled staffs start to look for what could potentially be a weak point on Cemetery Ridge. Lee and Longstreet are clearly planning the next step together. There are numerous accounts that talk to that. But as you said, they're kind of looking for a weak point on Cemetery Ridge. Now, of course, this starts to transition into what has become a debate over what is the objective. Is the objective Cemetery Ridge? Is the objective Cemetery Hill? Obviously, there are proponents of both theories. I've got my own opinions on it. But what do you think, Eric?
There is some question as to what the objective is. For years and years, the focal point has always been that famous copse of trees on Cemetery Ridge. This is where Lee is aiming. Some people will say that Lee is aiming maybe more toward Ziegler's Grove. Others will say, no, it's nothing on Cemetery Ridge, it's Cemetery Hill itself. As I've kind of assessed all the primary source materials, my personal view on this, right or wrong, is I don't necessarily know if Cemetery Hill is the direct objective. I think a potential capture of Cemetery Ridge would make an assault on Cemetery Hill a lot easier, especially with Confederate artillery there to possibly support other units moving towards Cemetery Hill, which would be an objective, but I don't think necessarily Pickett's Charge itself is heading up towards Cemetery Hill.
Yeah, and you're right. We've got a lot of conflicting accounts on this. Longstreet, in his own report, basically says that the assault was to be made directly at the enemy's main position, the Cemetery Hill. However, later in his report, which I'll touch on later, he also talks about the direction of his column of attack, which is clearly not at Cemetery Hill. You know, my take on this has been, and I'm going to go back to Lee's military secretary, Armstead Long, who I kind of opened with. I think Armstead Long gives the clearest and most concise description of what the objective is. And we got to caveat it. Long wrote this in the 1880s when the Lost Cause BS was flying back and forth. And, you know, somebody out there is going to say, Jim, you can't trust anything that Lee's staff wrote. But in this particular case, he is not really doing it to cast blame or really credit on anybody. And quite frankly, it brings up one of those instances where I think the description is consistent with the terrain, which is consistent with the actions of the Confederate soldiers. So I'm going to read Armstead Long's description, and I think this is what they're going for. Quote, Cemetery Ridge was at every point strongly occupied by Federal infantry and artillery. There was, however, a weak point upon which an attack could be made with a reasonable prospect of success. This was where the ridge, sloping westward, formed the depression through which the Emmitsburg Road passes. Perceiving that by forcing the Federal lines at that point and turning towards Cemetery Hill, the right would be taken in flank and the remainder would be neutralized, as its fire would be as destructive to friend as foe, generally determined to attack at that point. Long says we picked that spot on Cemetery Ridge to basically cut the Union line in half at that point and turn towards Cemetery Hill. That makes sense with the way the attack unfolds. I think that makes sense from sort of a strategic and tactical point of view. He also then says that ultimately Cemetery Hill was the ultimate objective, which I think satisfies anybody who thinks it should have been Cemetery Hill. And frankly, I just think, to me, that makes the most sense. And it's kind of how everything is going to subsequently play out. And noticeably absent from that description was any reference to the copse of trees. So if you're somebody who doesn't like the copse of trees as an objective, great, it's not in that description. He's talking about hitting a broad expanse of Cemetery Ridge where it sort of slopes into the Emmitsburg Road. So I think, frankly, Eric, Long's description has something for everybody.
And I think, too, if you just look at the battlefield, one of the things I sometimes like to do is go into Google Earth where you can use the ruler to measure points of distance from locations. And if you look at what would be the right of this attack, Wilcox and Lang, think about where they're coming from and then try to have them go all the way over to Cemetery Hill. Think about Pickett's division coming all the way to Cemetery Hill. Even Pettigrew and Trimble's guys. That's not a reasonable expectation. Getting that foothold on Cemetery Ridge gives you a much better chance of supporting attacks further, which leads us to a question that one of our listeners gave us as to, all right, this thing works. What maybe is Lee thinking as a follow-up to this?
Yeah, so I want to hesitate answering a question like that because it can be easily interpreted as, well, Jim and Eric were saying the plan was a good idea, or Jim and Eric were saying it could work.
Or we're doing what ifs.
Yeah, or we're doing what ifs. So I'm only hesitant from that point of view. But again, if you go back to what Long said that if this works, essentially, again, we're going to cut that line in half and we're going to turn towards Cemetery Hill. There are then subsequent references, which I think we're going to talk about, regarding possibly sending in Anderson's division from A.P. Hill's Corps. So there's additional infantry as support. And of course, bringing in the artillery, which also shows up in the reports and adds kind of a whole new context to this. The idea that we're going to push the cannons forward with the advancing infantry as well. So, again, I'm not saying that would have worked. I'm not saying it could have worked. The results kind of show that it didn't work, but I'm answering the what do I think Lee was thinking question.
And I have to think that Lee doesn't just plan one segment of this, okay, we're successful, and then we'll figure it out when we get there. I have to think Lee has a logical progression in his head of how this is going to go, but I think Lee is also probably careful enough as a commander to see how it plays out before we commit to this. Mm-hmm. So let's see how this thing works out, and then we'll get into it. But it doesn't, to me, seem like he's just going to wing it when this happens. I think he does probably have a follow-up. Of course, we'll never see how it works because the attack doesn't succeed.
Yeah, and again, in various reports touch on the follow-ups. They touch on the role of Hill's Corps, Anderson's division, the role of the artillery. The other thing that I want to add, too, though, is, this notion might sound crazy, but remember, late afternoon of July 2nd, this is the general area that Wright's brigade reached, almost penetrated, but was ultimately forced back. So, folks, the targeted objective can be reached. The question is, can it be held? And clearly to this point about Lee and the follow-ups, Lee is thinking, okay, well, I'm going to try to reach that position again with more troops in greater depth, with greater artillery support, concert of action, which is what he talked about. And that's all kind of what Lee is thinking. Now, again, the devil's advocate here could say, well, that was a quite different situation for the Union Army. July 2nd, they were under attack on multiple fronts. July 3rd, they've had time to more or less kind of retrench and refortify. And if you're thinking that, you're right. And again, that might be why it doesn't work. But that, again, is, I think, what Lee is thinking.
And I think that is a good point, because this is a different situation that allows Ambrose Wright's Georgians to pierce the Union line there. But what we forget is that this is happening, there's essentially a gap in the Union line at this point on July 2nd. What is Lee hoping his artillery will blow open in the middle of the Union line? So I think Lee is trying to replicate July 2nd to some extent. If his artillery is successful, it's going to give the infantry a chance to make those breakthroughs. Wright is not successful in holding it because he has no one to support him. If you can get the troops up there with support, with a disorganized, routed enemy, you might have a chance to not only break through that line, but hold it. And I think that's what's going through Lee's mind on July 3rd.
I agree. And I think if you think the infantry attack was supposed to be directed directly against Cemetery Hill, you not only have to explain why, frankly, none of the troops in the attack are anywhere near Cemetery Hill, but you also then, to make that point stick, you also have to take a fair number of aftermath accounts and kind of say, well, the trees, this is what they meant, and they confused this for that. And, you really have to throw a lot of hypothesis and alternate scenarios into the idea that the attack should have gone up the west slope of Cemetery Hill, whereas basically the scenario that I think happens, it's consistent with, again, how all of Longstreet's troop dispositions play out. And should we talk about that, or did you have anything else you wanted to cover first?
I think we can get to that in a moment, but I think what we are getting to is the initial planning of Lee's attack. But there is a part of Lee's plan that a lot of visitors think is a part of it, but is not. And that is, of course, our good friend Jeb Stuart, east of town. You don't know how many times in a tour I have where I'm explaining what Lee is doing. They say, all right, now when does Jeb Stuart come riding around? This is something I think we should at least address, because it's not part of Lee's plan, but I think in popular books that have been written on the battle and in some people's minds, this is a part of Lee's attack that just there is no evidence for.
Heavens, how could we get so far into the episode and forget the role of Stuart's cavalry? Actually, true story. So when Wayne and I go out on the speaking circuit to promote our Pickett's Charge book, we intentionally leave Stuart out of the presentation because we want to be guaranteed at least one question. And this is almost always the first question that we get. What was the role of Stuart on July 3rd? I hate to keep punting everything to future episodes, but geez, this topic is just so rich. We can keep going down different rabbit holes. Jeb Stuart's role on July 3rd is to place himself on the flank of the Confederate Army. And I do believe potentially harass the enemy in the event of an enemy retreat. That is essentially what Stuart is ordered to do. There is nothing to support a notion, though, that Stuart is coordinated with Pickett's charge, and that, Lee has somehow said, General Stuart, meet me at the copse of trees at 4:00, or anything of the notion that Stuart knows he is to fight his way to the Baltimore Pike, then turn right, fight his way over to the Taneytown Road, then cut across country to the angle and again strike Hancock's men in the rear. There's nothing at all in the contemporary record to suggest that was part of the plan. I do think Stuart knows there's going to be some action on July 3rd, and Stuart, being Stuart, is going to look for an opportunity to harass the Yankees. But frankly, I think that's about the extent of it. So it's not, in my opinion, part of Pickett's charge.
And I agree with that. I think certainly Stuart is intended to make some mischief out there. If we have a breakthrough, if you can support that, by all means do so. But I don't think this is a critical part of Lee's plan that some people make it out to. Now, in conjecture and in theory, it sounds great. It's a good plan, but it doesn't match up with what was written by those that participated in this. It doesn't match up with really the terrain, and it really just doesn't make a lot of sense with the condition of Stuart's troops at this point to expect them to do this on July 3rd. So now that we've sort of put to rest troops that will not be part of this plan or were not intended to be part of this plan, let's start to talk a little bit about the evolution of the troops that will take part in this, because it's a little fluid as we look at this on July 3rd as Lee is planning this assault.
Yeah, and Lee talks about it. And, by Lee's own admission, Longstreet had been delayed by a force occupying the high rocky hills, that would be the Round Tops, from which his troops could be attacked in reverse as they advanced. Because of this, they decide that Longstreet's divisions under Hood and McLaws are essentially going to defend the flank and the rear and not participate directly in this attack. So what Lee gives Longstreet instead is what they call Heath's division, which had been badly shot up on July 1st, and 2 brigades of Pender's division. Now, as probably any good Gettysburg enthusiast knows, Heath's division is going to fall under Johnston Pettigrew on this day, and then the 2 brigades under Pender are ultimately going to be assigned to General Trimble. Eric, anything you want to talk about Pettigrew's command?
Funny you should mention Johnston Pettigrew, because I'm actually finishing up work on a regimental history of the 26th North Carolina, which was a key part of Pettigrew's brigade. But I think what's interesting to look at here is we have 2 new division commanders essentially involved in this attack. Johnston Pettigrew has never commanded a division in his life. Now at Gettysburg, he performs very well as a brigade commander. The success of his brigade on July 1st on McPherson's Ridge certainly speaks to that, but it is a challenge to immediately jump from brigade command to division command. So I think we're going to see they do perform fairly well, but there is something to look at. There's a lot of units here that have been badly mauled on July 1st. The 26th North Carolina is a great example. The 11th North Carolina is a great example. Men in Alfred Scales's brigade, now under William Lowrance, is a great example of this. So we're having some units that have new leaders that are maybe not in the peak shape they should be, that are now being brought into this attack. Of course, we could argue some of the units in McLaws or Hood are in the same situation. At least these guys have had essentially a day off to recover and try to fill their ranks as best they can.
Yeah, some great points there, Eric. And at the risk of sounding like a couple of stuffy, boring guys, what do we have in common with Pettigrew? We've all written books.
We have. And at least for me, I'm from Eastern North Carolina.
I just hope that the young people are reading books. But anyways, that was a little inside baseball joke there. But yeah, getting back to sort of the whole notion of command and control, which is obviously going to be problematic on this part of the field. Of course, there's the account of Lee and Trimble that morning as they are riding over the ground occupied by Heath's division under Pettigrew and looking at the bandaged up men and things to that effect, where Lee supposedly looks around and says, these poor boys, they are unfit to be here today. We shouldn't even be using them, but this attack must succeed, and things to that nature. Eric, what do you think about the idea of committing Heath's division when there are clearly fresher brigades on the field who are not being called upon? Obviously, that's something that Pickett's Charge enthusiasts have scratched their head over for the last 156 years.
I'll fully admit it's something I'm still scratching my head over right now. Why is a unit like the 26th North Carolina being brought into this? Why is a unit like the 11th North Carolina being brought into this? If anything, it's where they are in the line. They're already there. So if we're trying to move these troops around, that does take time. So there's something to be said, they're already there.
Right.
And also, when I look at the contemporary accounts from Pettigrew's brigade, you do have 2 regiments in that brigade, the 47th North Carolina and the 52nd North Carolina, that have gotten off relatively easy on July 1st. They were outflanking Biddle's men, so they're not going to really bear the brunt that the 11th and the 26th suffer. But even in the 26th North Carolina, I have letters written just a few weeks after the battle that will say that our men were as ready for the fight on July 3rd as they were on July 1st. So even though some of these units are battered, I think their spirits are still relatively high. And that's something that's important on a battlefield. Morale and motivation is critical.
Interesting. Yeah. So if you look for alternate troops, obviously some of the brigades in Anderson's division of Hill's Corps would obviously be in fresher condition than some of Heath's guys. One of the listeners brought up Billy Mahone's brigade. Mahone, Posey, 2 guys that you could look at. Clearly there seems to be a role for Anderson's division to support the attack and follow up as needed. But the thing that's always been interesting to me is you look at specifically half of Pender's division ultimately going under Trimble, kind of wondering even why they chose the brigades that they chose there. And, I always look at Thomas's brigade in Long Lane as basically being perhaps the best example of an underutilized, more or less full-strength Confederate brigade. Now, they're in Long Lane, and some people would say they're probably staying in Long Lane to possibly address skirmishing on the western slope of Cemetery Hill, and, I can't dispute any of that. But certainly if you look at some of the brigades chosen on this part of the field, there's also a couple in the immediate neighborhood that would, at least from a strength point of view, would have seemed to have been better choices. Do we blame that on staff work? What do you think?
I think it might be a little combination of each. Probably a little poor staff work, but I also go back to my point I made. They're in the area.
Yeah.
It takes time to move troops around.
You mean this isn't fantasy football?
This is not fantasy football. You're not just moving them around.
From running back to the bench kind of thing.
And if Lee is sort of looking at having this thing happen sooner than later, having the memories the day before of an attack going off later than Lee intended, sometimes you're going to sacrifice numbers for just getting them out there and getting this attack rolling. Also, a unit like Thomas's Georgians, they could play a role in follow-up.
Yeah.
So where do you allocate these resources? You have a unit even like John Brockenbraugh's Virginia Brigade, which, of course, the native North Carolinian, I always like to point out, they broke first.
Right.
But that's a unit that, what are they doing in that attack?
Right.
Once again, they're there.
Right.
And, hey, if everything works out, this might work. But so much of what we think about when we look at battles and strategies is not so much what a general wants to do, but what are they capable of doing? Mm-hmm. What are they actually able to do?
Yeah.
And I think Lee is looking at what he has at hand, and he's rolling the dice a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe these troops will get the job done.
Yeah, Armchair General Hessler is throwing Thomas's brigade into that attack. But otherwise, then again, when you get back to the listener question about Mahone's brigade, again, I think, right or wrong, there seems to be a very specific role designed for Anderson's division, and I got to assume those brigades are going to be assumed to come into the breach should there be any success. Or possibly cover a retreat or anything of that nature, too.
And a point, too, we talk about the condition of some of these units. Let's look at the leadership in this thing. We got Longstreet, we've got A.P. Hill around there, but let's look at the division commanders. If you would have, Jim made the joking reference to fantasy football. If you're having your fantasy football draft of the Army of Northern Virginia, you're not picking George Pickett as your division commander with your first pick. Also, you have Isaac Trimble, who is a tested commander at that level. Mm-hmm. He's had some success, but these are also new troops under his command.
Yeah, he says, I don't know any of these guys.
And also, Pettigrew is an untested commodity at this level. By all accounts, he's a sharp, talented individual. Once again, he's never had division command. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things here that as we look at leadership, we look at command structure, there's a lot of red flags going up here that we can see right now.
Well, and the biggest red flag of all, as you mentioned, would be Brockenbrough on the left flank. Brockenbrough, however people pronounce it. I'm going to say Brockenbrough.
I just say Broken Ran.
You Broken Ran. Oh, I like that. Brockenbrough, basically on the left flank. I think most people would probably agree Brockenbrough is the weakest brigade in the entire assault, and they're on the extreme left flank of the attack. So again, if you think the infantry is directed directly to Cemetery Hill, you've literally put your weakest brigade in the entire assault right up against that hill, which again speaks to the idea that no, folks, Cemetery Ridge is actually the objective. But, then when you get now into that back line with half of Pender's division being commanded by Trimble, again, to me, what has always been interesting, and again, I think it speaks to the interpretation that I've always had of this charge, where does Longstreet deploy Lane and Lawrence's brigades? Not behind Pettigrew's left, but against or behind Pettigrew's right. He puts these two brigades in support behind Pettigrew's right, which is going to lend weight to the portion of the column that is directed against Cemetery Ridge. So not only do we have some interesting leadership choices going on here, some interesting choices of brigades, but I think some interesting choices of the placement of that back line, which help us uncover the mystery of what was Robert E. Lee thinking. Man, I feel like a detective today. I'm like Sherlock Holmes here in the mine. Maybe like my little bubble pipe or something. I'm fired up. I've been listening to too many wrestling podcasts.
Yeah, I think as the great Jim Cornette would have said, John Brockenbrough never drew money anywhere in any territory. And now he's on the left flank of the Confederate Army in the most important attack of the year.
Exactly. This is like giving the championship belt to Tommy Rich.
Yeah, who does that? Immediately, everybody's going to Google right now, Googling, what the heck are these guys talking about?
Yeah, what are they, too inside baseball at this point?
Hey, but we're talking about Southerners. Why not talk about classic Southern wrestling?
There you go. Okay, so where did we leave off? We've deployed Pettigrew's guys. We've deployed Trimble's guys. Do we want to talk a little bit about the dress of the attack?
Absolutely.
Which goes back to my pre-wrestling comments about kind of putting the weight behind Pettigrew's right and not his left.
And also, let's look at Pickett's division as they're moving out. They essentially have 2 brigades protecting their right as they move out. The Alabama Brigade of Cadmus Wilcox and the Florida Brigade under Colonel David Lang.
See, I think those guys are problematic. So I think we're might throw a little heat on Longstreet for that one. And I know the Longstreet people aren't going to like that, but like I said, I'm fired up today.
Let's go ahead. Let's throw some heat.
All right, well, let's go first. Let's finish the thought first with the dress of the attack. So the idea being, if y'all have a map of Pickett's Charge in front of you, and doggone it, I am looking at my own Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg that I co-authored with Wayne Motts, and I'm looking at Steve Stanley's fantastic map on page 73 as an example. You know, I would encourage maybe that would be one that you could reference.
If you're following along at home, which you should be.
Which you should. Yes, if you're driving in your vehicle, do not pull the book out and start looking at the maps. So anyways, so if you kind of look at this, remember the dress of the attack, which is essentially in layman's terms the direction of the attack. Fry's brigade on the right of Pettigrew's front line. Fry basically at some point is going to go over and meet with Pickett and Garnett and some of the boys in Pickett's division and try to determine the dress of the attack. And they determine that Garnett, who is on Pickett's left, is going to dress or basically follow the direction of Fry's brigade on Pettigrew's right. Now, folks, if you more or less draw a straight line from the right of Fry's brigade, which they say is going to be the direction of the attack, that essentially gets you in and around the angle on Cemetery Ridge. I mean, folks, that's where the attack is aiming for. And Longstreet backs that up by putting Lawrence's brigade behind Fry. That's the direction of the attack. And so that, I think, at least kind of addresses what's going on the left. And then, as Eric alluded to, maybe talk a little bit about Wilcox and Lang on Pickett's right.
So clearly, Wilcox and Lang are going to play a role in this. To me, though, this is a little problematic.
Yeah.
We have 2 brigades that are from the division of Richard Anderson from A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps having to, once again, we use this term a lot, work in concert with the division of George Pickett from the Confederate 1st Corps under Longstreet. So this seems a very kind of odd alignment here. Jim, do you have a little bit more on Wilcox?
Well, yeah, and I've got problems with this. You know, the whole point about what is Wilcox's role in terms of supporting Pickett's division. And again, I think we had a listener question to this effect. Wilcox says in his report, quote, "The advance had not been made more than 20 or 30 minutes before 3 staff officers in quick succession, including one from the major general commanding the division, which would be Anderson, gave me orders to advance to the support of Pickett's division." Wilcox then says, you know, my brigade, about 1,200 men, moved forward. As we advanced, we changed direction. But with all of the smoke and the artillery fire and that everything was going on, Wilcox adds, quote, "Not a man of the division that I was ordered to support could I see, but as my orders were to go to their support, on my men went down the slope until they came near the hill upon which were the enemy's batteries and entrenchments." I personally think that this is an oversight on the part of the Confederate leadership, and while some interpretations will tell us that Wilcox and Lang were planned to go forward immediately to support Pickett's right flank, I believe it's almost an afterthought. Now, there's a story that comes out later, again, post-war BS, take it or leave it if you want it, but where one of Pickett's staff officers supposedly goes up and finds Longstreet during the assault, and Pickett has sent the staff officer back asking for support. Longstreet is talking to Colonel Fremantle, and Fremantle, is saying, "Good day, General Longstreet. I would not have missed this for the world." And Longstreet says to the effect of, "The devil you wouldn't have. The attack has failed. Look." And as he is saying that, Pickett's staff officer comes up looking for support. Longstreet says to the staff officer, basically, "Didn't you just hear what I told Colonel Fremantle? Go tell General Pickett the attack has failed." But before the staff officer can ride off, Longstreet says, "Whoa, wait a minute. Just kidding. Hey, go to that peach orchard over there and throw in Wilcox's brigade." So the staff officer then goes up to Wilcox. Again, Wilcox in his own report says, I got 3 orders in quick succession. Wilcox, or old Billy Fixon, as we like to call him, Billy Fixon kind of throws up his hands and says, I know, I'll get going in a minute here. And again, by Wilcox's own report, it's about 20 or 30 minutes after Pickett. And by that time, Pickett is out of sight. And while Pickett's guys veer to the left towards the cops and the high water mark, Wilcox's guys more or less just go straight into the teeth of McGilvery's artillery. So I think it's an oversight. I think it might have been something that, we were kind of told during the planning, have these guys ready to support Pickett's division as needed. But this whole movement to protect Pickett's right flank, tragically, comes too little too late.
And I often wonder, from what we've sort of gleaned so far, there seems to be a lot of confusion at this moment.
Yeah, sure.
And who's to say that at one point these guys were not considered for this role? They were talked about for this role, but maybe somehow the ball got dropped with getting the message out there. There's a lot of things going on.
Yeah.
And once again, we're dealing with multiple corps working together.
Yeah.
This is something that doesn't always work well in the Confederate Army. And we've seen that at examples like the 7 Days. We'll see that at Gettysburg, especially, where it could just be in the confusion and chaos of everything. This just gets sort of forgotten about, which, of course, as Jim said, will have very tragic consequences later in the day.
This whole role of Anderson's division is interesting. Hill says in his report, yes, folks, A.P. Hill files a report on the Battle of Gettysburg. And Hill says in his report, quote, I was directed to hold my line with Anderson's division and half of Pender's. Anderson says in his report, I received orders to hold my division in readiness to move up in support if it should become necessary. Wilcox and Perry's brigades had been moved forward so as to be in position to render assistance or take advantage of any success gained by the assaulting column. And I think that's part of it. Eric, you said the confusion, the chaos, everything is going on. It's very difficult for any one person to coordinate, but when they realize they need that support from Anderson's division, again, it's too little too late.
So we have spent a lot of time going through and working through the infantry components of what becomes known as Pickett's Charge. But there is one element of this attack that we have not yet talked about that will play a critical role, and I would even argue is the single most important part of this attack, the role of the artillery.
Yeah, I think we've really saved the best for last. It's ironic, again, when we go out on the Civil War Roundtable speaking circuit, I usually focus a lot of the Pickett's Charge dialogue on the artillery because I think more than anything, that's the concert of action that Lee had touched upon in his reports that he was really counting on. Folks, if you stand at the Virginia Monument and you look across that field and you think this is a doomed effort, remember, if the Confederate artillery can suppress the Federal artillery, if that can happen, Confederate infantry can actually get across the majority of that field without taking any fire. So it's clear that Lee was hinging, so to speak, on making sure that his artillery overpowered the Yankee artillery. And what Lee says in the report, Longstreet's batteries were placed in positions. Again, we've talked about the Peach Orchard and the Emmitsburg Road, which would enable them to silence those of the enemy. Hill's artillery and part of Ewell's was ordered to open simultaneously. So, folks, this is the only way Lee can take advantage of being on the exterior lines if he can converge fire onto Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill from multiple directions. Alexander from the Peach Orchard area, Hill from Northern Seminary Ridge, and then Ewell from Oak Ridge, Oak Hill, and Benner's Hill in these positions north of town. If you can fire on the Yankee artillery from multiple directions, that's going to be your best opportunity to drive them off the field. Again, it doesn't work, but that's clearly what Lee was thinking in terms of trying to overpower his opponents. The other component of the artillery that he mentions is the assaulting column was to advance under cover of the combined fire of the three. The batteries were directed to be pushed forward as the infantry progressed, protect their flanks, and support the attack closely.
For the artillery to be successful, there has to be coordination. And to coordinate artillery, you need a strong leader to facilitate that coordination. Now, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, and maybe one day we will talk about this when we talk about the Union response to this attack. But one of the reasons for Union success in repulsing this attack is the performance of the Union artillery, in large part to officers such as Freeman McGilvery, and more importantly, Brigadier General Henry Hunt, who oversees that arm of the Union force.
Yeah.
I will argue what Lee really needs on July 3rd is an officer like Henry Hunt. Now, granted, Henry Hunts don't grow on trees. But what we do have is William Pendleton, who really, what does he really do other than cause problems on July 3rd? You do not see an active role in Pendleton or his staff trying to coordinate the batteries of three separate Army Corps to have a concerted effort on this day.
Yeah, and so absolutely what you get is basically all three corps operating by themselves, which obviously speaks against this concert of action or coordination that Lee obviously wanted. So if you take the reports at face value, getting back to our earlier point about the batteries being directed to be pushed forward as the infantry progressed and to protect the flanks, again, there are naysayers in the audience. I've read some of your books. There are naysayers in the audience who are going to say, look, there's no way that could have worked. The batteries being pushed forward to protect the flanks and so on and so forth. I think Lee thought it could work, and that's really the point of the episode today. This was a role that Lee expected the artillery. Alexander knew it. Again, it's debatable whether or not Hill's artillery guys knew it. Hill's artillery guys only say to the effect of, after we captured the Cemetery Ridge and the Cemetery Hill, we were to move forward and to unlimber our batteries on it. So whether you're told to move forward to protect the flanks or to just follow up in the wake of the attack, it's obvious that the batteries are supposed to move forward in some way, shape, or form to support the infantry. And again, it doesn't happen.
So now the play has been called. The pieces are in place. The question now is, from a lot of folks, is, okay, yeah, great, you got a plan, but can it actually work? Is there a realistic chance of this being successful? And I believe there are some historical parallels that we can look at and examples that show that, at least in Lee's mind, he thinks there is a chance this can work, and he has examples to back this up.
Yeah, great point, Eric. And again, the naysayers who will stand on the field and shake their head, have often said to the effect that Robert E. Lee did not understand the power of the rifled musket, did not understand the power of the artillery, and, just ordered this suicidal frontal assault because by 1863, Robert E. Lee clearly did not understand what was then modern weaponry. That's kind of ridiculous. And to your point about precedents and historical examples, one of them would be Gaines Mill during the 7 days in June of 1862. Now, basically, and I'm no 7 days expert, but in essence, what happened was a portion of the Union Army's 5th Corps was isolated into what you could kind of describe as a salient out in front of the remainder of the Union Army. Lee was able to basically get superior numbers on the field, and with successful support from his artillery, was able to make a successful attack. And what Gaines Mill showed was basically that an attack in depth could work if you could isolate your opponent and get superior numbers, if you could bring artillery support to bear. Well, at least those three things seem to be part of the plan of Pickett's charge. You also need to make the terrain work, and as always in civil warfare, you need to get some cooperation from your opponent, which you can argue does not happen at Pickett's charge. But Gaines Mill, almost a year and a week to the day, is an example of how this sort of attack can work if it is executed properly.
And I will also add, think about what Robert E. Lee sees on July 1st, late in the day. The Union First Corps is essentially fallen back to Seminary Ridge. William Dorsey Pender's division launches a frontal assault against that position and drives those troops back. Of course, those troops are exhausted. Some of them are demoralized. They've been fought out. So it's not a tough foe to what they're going to be facing on Cemetery Ridge at this point. But it does show Lee that it can work. Lee sees it with his own eyes. Lee also sees just 2 days before his veteran troops, some of these same troops that are going to be in Pickett's charge, driving a Union force back. So I think in Lee's mind, this is possible. Now, we mentioned a battle from the 7 days earlier, Gaines's Mill. But what about another battle from the 7 days? Malvern Hill, just a year and 2 days before this assault. And in many ways, there's a lot of parallels to Malvern Hill to this. And when you really assess the 7 days, you're seeing Lee is new to command. He has a lot of commanders he has not worked with before. You see some issues with coordination. You see some issues with messages being delivered, with people working in a timely manner, a lot of moving parts. Well, what's Pickett's charge? Lee is working with a lot of commanders that he's never really worked with before, at least directly. People like Johnston Pettigrew, Isaac Trimble are now key players in this. That really, how much interaction has Lee had with either of them? Longstreet's a known quantity. That's why Lee puts Longstreet in command of this.
Right.
There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things that have to go right. And we're going to see, at least in my mind, the same problems that are going to plague the Confederate attack at Malvern Hill are going to plague this attack moving forward. So, of course, we do have examples where it works. We also have a major example where it doesn't work. But what Lee is doing is he's playing the odds. And folks, with any attack, there is always a certain percentage that this attack will not work. It's the job of a general to assess, is the risks worth the potential success? And I think Lee on July 3rd makes the assumption and the determination that we have a chance to do this. Whether or not it is a 20 to 30% chance, if you want to try to put odds on it, it's still a chance, and at this moment, it's the best chance Lee has to win this battle.
Yeah, and some of our listeners have said you and I don't disagree enough. I personally don't even characterize Lee as taking a gamble on July 3rd. I think he thinks he's got enough pieces in place that he can make it work. Now, obviously, his old warhorse, James Longstreet, is not enthusiastic about the idea. And again, Longstreet's critics, including some colleagues that I know, think that most of Longstreet's disagreement to the plan is really post-war posturing. I do not personally believe that. I think Longstreet's objections are noted on the field. During the morning conference, he says to the effect that his guns could be dominated by federal guns on the Round Tops. And Armstead Long makes the ridiculous rebuttal that the Confederate guns at the Peach Orchard can overpower Little Round Top, which is, obviously not true. But I think there's enough instances that Longstreet is clearly not on board with the plan and not enthusiastic about it. The question, though, that has always consumed historians is, does that lack of enthusiasm hinder Longstreet's performance? Eric, any thoughts on that?
I don't see anything in Longstreet's behavior that makes me think that he is purposely trying to sabotage this attack. I think as a good soldier, you may not agree with it, but you do your duty. Longstreet does the best he can. And I think we also have to look at kind of the time frame that this is happening. By 10:30, Ewell's repulsed from Culp's Hill. We now have this attack beginning at about 1 o'clock, 1:30, depending on which account you read. At least with the artillery barrage, that this is, even though it's a compact amount of time, I think there is some logical thoughts that have been put forward. But as we've talked about even in the Peach Orchard episode, Longstreet is a very meticulous planner. This is trying to put Longstreet kind of under the gun here, under the clock.
Yeah.
Doesn't really work to Longstreet's strengths as a commander, but it's what he's been put into.
Right.
So despite the challenges, I think Longstreet does, to the best of his ability, everything he can to try to make this an attack.
Yeah, agree. And again, the idea with you're going to be successful if you can get the artillery support. That doesn't happen. And I think if you can attack in depth, which ultimately the length of the opposing lines doesn't allow that to happen. And then again, you're burdened with this idea of, again, having to move across corps, issue commands to troops in the Third Corps, which is always going to be problematic. So no, I don't think Longstreet's lack of enthusiasm necessarily hurts his performance. I think he's, working with kind of a bad plan to begin with, doing what he can. There is a quote from somewhere, and geez, I can't remember the source. I can't remember where I read it, but I know somewhere somebody had said to Longstreet, if you were so against this, why did you not call it off? And Longstreet said, because the commanding general was on the ground and he could see everything that I could see. And if he was on the ground and didn't call it off, I couldn't call it off. And I think that summarizes Longstreet's dilemma. Longstreet said this was one of the saddest days of my life because I knew that sucker was going to fail, but I had to order it forward. And I think Longstreet's telling the truth on that. Longstreet's critics will say, no, he's just inventing that later. No, I think it's true.
And also, if you're Robert E. Lee, who are you putting in command of this attack?
Yeah, it ain't Hill.
It's Longstreet. He's your best pitcher. It's Game 7. You're putting the ball in his hands. And if anybody can do it, James Longstreet can. And I've gone on record as saying before, I feel Longstreet is Lee's best corps commander. He's got him right here. He's got the plan. As we know, it doesn't work. But, of course, that's another show altogether on why it does not work.
Yeah, right.
So as we did with the Peach Orchard episode, we're not going to delve into what happens after this action. We've kind of addressed the planning. I think we've done a really good deep dive into what is Lee thinking, what's the plan, how's this developed. So we're going to cover the attack itself, certainly at a later date, which there's a lot of ground to cover in that area. So as I mentioned before, we've kind of incorporated a lot of our listener questions into what we've talked about today, because we actually had, as of the time we recorded this, 16 questions from listeners for this episode. So we've tried to incorporate them as best we can, but there are 2 listener questions that we are not able to cover or weave in right now. The first comes from superfan Scott, who's going to ask, what did Lee believe the size of the Union force to be on Cemetery Ridge, and how accurate was his estimate? Now, I've studied this battle for a long, long time. To my knowledge, I cannot think of an account where Lee is pinning an exact number down. Let's just say, 8,000, 10,000 men there. I think Lee is working under the assumption that Meade has reinforced each end of his battle line, which certainly the results of July 2nd and July 3rd in the morning will suggest to Lee. So Lee is, I think, believing, hey, they got to come from somewhere. This is a weak part. Also, Wright has broken through the day before to further suggest that. And I think also Lee thinks, I don't care how many guys you have there. If the artillery works, it's going to render the numbers moot.
Right.
So maybe our listeners out there have something that we've never seen, which if so, let us know. We'd love to know.
Yeah.
But I've never seen anything that makes me think that Lee has an exact number that he's kind of playing with.
I can't think that I've ever seen a source on that either. A number of years ago when Wayne and I were given a Pickett's Charge talk, a member of the audience stood up and asserted quite definitively that Lee had a Hotchkiss map in his hand that accurately said the strength of the 2nd Corps, and the 6th Corps was right there, and the 5th Corps was over here, and it was clearly an after the battle fact. This was a couple of years ago. I think the map was from the OR Atlas, but it's one of those cases where the guy kind of was wrong, but he was saying it so definitively, kind of waving the bloody shirt on this Hotchkiss map, saying that yes, Lee knew the strength in exactly every regiment directly in front of him. Come on, no, he didn't. I mean, there's no way they could have known that in the heat of the moment on July 3rd. But if there is any sort of, flag counting going on to try to at least get a sense of how many regiments are out there, like I said off the top of my head, I can't think of any source that says that. That doesn't mean they're not out there. I just can't think of one.
And I think, too, let's look at what Lee would have maybe known. On July 1st, he's cut up pretty bad the 1st and 11th Corps. On July 2nd, he's pretty much mauled the 3rd Corps. He's given some heavy losses to the 5th Corps and to the 2nd Corps. We're looking at the 12th Corps. We're looking at the 6th Corps right now. So I think Lee's kind of looking at, hey, we've bloodied their nose a good bit. As Lee's looking at this, I could see that logical progression to think, but as Jim said, once again, to my knowledge, there is no document out there that Lee is working with actual numbers here. So that's one that we can't really give you a definitive answer, but I think we've tried to answer it the best of our ability with
maybe
what we know.
Like you said, if somebody out there has got something, share it on Facebook. Let's see what we've got.
All right, so our last listener question of the night is from superfan Doug in Canada, Barksdale's #1 fan.
Yes.
And a great guy, and a great
fan guy,
of the show.
Doug. Yeah, exactly.
He's going to ask a question, a more general question of, do you believe Lee's health problems influenced his decision on July 3rd? As many students of the battle know, in 1863, Lee is dealing with some issues with his heart, some cardiovascular issues. Yep. He also is suffering from a more common camp ailment, diarrhea.
Yeah.
So to what extent that impacts his thinking, I don't know if we have an account where Lee is saying, hey, guys, I can't plan this. I've got to go behind my tent, or, hey, I'm just not feeling it today. I'm pretty lethargic. I have to think it will impact you, but human beings are pretty resilient.
Yeah.
Lee is a pretty resilient guy.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is at Chancellorsville, Lee's dealing with heart issues. At Chancellorsville, he has his greatest victory.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes the health issues are sort of for lack of a better term, a crutch for Lee's performance. I think certainly if Lee felt that they were hindering him to the point where he could not exercise command, he would have done what a good soldier does and says, hey, I can't do this right now.
Yeah, and again, it's an interesting question. Hey, superfan Doug up in the Great White North. I think it's an interesting question from Doug. And again, it's all speculative. My thoughts on this are kind of twofold. One, Lee is thinking pretty aggressively on July 3rd. And I don't know. And again, this is all speculation. I'm not a doctor. When I'm not feeling well, I tend to not be thinking aggressively. Again, I would kind of be more in a laid back sort of, hey, let's not do anything mode. So that's just Jim kind of speculating on it. Thinking, though, about what Lee wrote about Pickett's charge and, what he says in his after action report, I think he says to the effect, we were let down by the artillery. The artillery was low on ammunition. And in one of the reports, I know he says, the artillery was low on ammunition, and this fact was unknown to me when I ordered the charge. Now, if you fast forward a couple of days, and keep me honest here because I'm going by memory, when Lee, offers his resignation to Davis a couple of days later, doesn't Lee say to the effect, with my failing health here, I have to rely on others, and I am often misled, by their judgments sort of thing? You could kind of argue he's talking at least a little bit about Pickett's charge there. I was relying on my artillery guys to tell me what was going on, and I was misled. So I'm just making speculation here. I think that's the closest connection I can get to thinking, Lee's health is impacting him on July 3rd, just based on what he tells Davis afterwards. Again, all speculation, but hey, good stuff.
And of course, an after-action report is a after-battle reflection on what happened.
Yeah, right.
In the moment, I don't know if Lee's consciously thinking, I'm being let down here. So I do think that, if we do look at the health, it's there. I don't know to what extent.
Yeah.
I think also, this health issue, I think is really perpetuated in large part because of the Killer Angels and the portrayal of Lee in the movie Gettysburg. It's sort of this sick, weak general at times that in our mind, whether or not we think about it consciously or subconsciously, it's there. And I think we like to think that somebody as great as Lee, it's got to be a bad ticker. It's got to be diarrhea.
I think there's definitely some of that.
Lee at full health is going to fail.
Right,
which, you know what? There's plenty of really talented people at peak performance that have failed.
Right.
It happens. Right. It's life. And I think that kind of what happens here at Gettysburg.
Now, before somebody corrects us on that, we must acknowledge, yes, there are accounts that say Lee is off his game at Gettysburg. And I think, Eric, you segued into what will be an upcoming episode because we, folks, are going to do the movie. Yes, the movie. And I think, one of the comments you made about the portrayal of Lee would maybe fit into that. So maybe between now and then we could kind of dust off some of these accounts of, a more sickly Lee at Gettysburg and kind of compare and contrast with the cinematic portrayal of General Lee at Gettysburg.
Absolutely. And that, of course, will be our next episode as we delve into the movie Gettysburg. Now, we're not going to do a watch-along with this. We're not going to go blow by blow for 4.5, 5 hours. We're not doing that. But I think what we're going to talk about is things that they get right, things they maybe get wrong, things that are kind of where are they getting this from, and talk about how it's influenced our thinking, because I think both of us as battlefield guides can attest to this day the movie still influences how people view this battle.
Or does it? Find out when you tune into the movie episode. So, folks, we've ran long here. We got to wrap up the episode. To summarize what I think Lee was thinking on July 3rd at Gettysburg, he was looking for concert of action between the infantry and the artillery. He was looking for his artillery to basically overpower their opponents. And then the attack was directed to Cemetery Ridge with an object of basically cutting the Union Army in half and turning towards Cemetery Hill. There were precedents why he thought this could work. Ultimately, it didn't work. And that's my interpretation. I think Eric's interpretation of what was Lee thinking on July 3rd at Gettysburg. Feel free to disagree with us, but if you're going to disagree with us, come up with some source citations. 90% of at least what I was reading tonight was coming from the ORs, unfiltered by Lost Cause BS. So, take that into account too if you're going to kind of come up with a counter theory here, but we would love to hear your theories and feedback on Facebook. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
So, of course, as many of you know, and maybe if you're new to the show, you don't know, Jim and I are both battlefield guides here at Gettysburg National Military Park. So we always want to promote our fellow guides and guiding here at Gettysburg. If you're coming to the battlefield, best way to see this field is using a licensed battlefield guide. So as we close the show, we once again want to mention where you can find us on social media. On Facebook at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Gettysburg Pod, or just look up the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, and also on Instagram at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast. You can also email us at gettysburgpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, we want to thank you, the listeners, for spending your time with us as we go through these episodes. And we also want to urge you, if you really want to help out the show, there's a really easy way you can do that. Go online, go onto the various podcast platforms, write us a review. It means a lot to us to have these reviews. It's not just some might think to sort of stoke our egos and think how great we're doing, but the more 5-star reviews we get, the more algorithms we get into, the more publicity the show gets, the more people are going to get to be exposed to this. And I think we can all agree, the more people that are listening to and learning about the Battle of Gettysburg, the better.
Folks, isn't that what it's all about? Turning new audiences onto the Battle of Gettysburg. Again, I can't thank our core listening audience enough. Your support has been great, but again, we want to keep bringing the Gettysburg message and the story home to new people.
So with that, Jim and I both thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.
Aloha.